Tonight we step back in time, not to grand halls or royal banquets, but to a muddy village tucked in the French countryside. A place where horses outnumbered carriages and prayers were whispered under breath. This is where she came from, not a princess, not a trained warrior, just a teenage girl with hands calloused from work and eyes that saw more than they should have. Her name was Joan. But before she became of Arc, before kings kissed her hand or enemies feared her armor, she was just a girl who heard voices when no one else did. A girl who believed quietly, completely, in something greater than herself. This is not a story of epic battles or thundering speeches. It's the slower story. The in-between moments, the chill of sleeping on damp ground, the ache of riding for days, the silence before battle, the prayers whispered into fabric, the moments no one tells you about. So lay back. Let the world go quiet for a while and listen to the softer truth of what it really meant to be a teenage warrior like Joan of Arc. Because sometimes the bravest moments come without fanfare, and sometimes they start on dirt roads before the banners. Before the battlefield there were dirt roads, narrow, winding, and always wet with rain. The kind of roads where your feet sank ankle, deep in mud, and your shoes, if you had them, were ruined by morning. Joan knew these roads well. They weren't just paths to another village. They were the way to the chapel, the river, the pastures, and the fields where the wheat grew thin. Domrémy was small, and the world felt even smaller when you were a girl. She rose with the sun long before the bells rang. Her fingers were stiff from sleep, but there were animals to feed, bread to bake, and water to fetch. She carried buckets that weighed nearly as much as her, steadying them with her knees as she walked, trying not to spill. She didn't complain. There wasn't time for that. In those days, children didn't get to be children for long, and girls least of all. Joan's family wasn't poor by village standards. Her father was respected. They had a home with stone walls, a bit of land, and goats that always managed to break fences. But safety wasn't something people talked about. France was at war always, sometimes far away, sometimes close enough to smell. Soldiers passed through, often hungry, tired, sometimes wounded. They didn't look noble. They looked like ghosts in armor. Joan watched them from doorways, curious but cautious. Her mother would pull her back inside. Nothing good follows men with swords, she'd say, and yet Joan's heart stirred whenever she saw them. Not because of their power, but because of their pain. She noticed how their eyes stayed on the horizon, never quite resting. She noticed how even when they smiled, their shoulders remained tight, like they were still in battle. Something about them felt unfinished. Joan liked to visit the little church when no one else was around. The stone was always cool, even in summer. The candles flickered as if afraid. She'd kneel for long stretches, not always praying, sometimes just listening. The silence spoke louder than any sermon. That's where she first heard it, that feeling that something was waiting for her. Not a voice, not yet. Just the sense that her life wouldn't stay here forever. Outside, the dirt roads twisted on, uncaring. They didn't know they carried a girl who would one day carry a nation. They only knew feet hooves, rain, and the soft sound of a girl walking home with questions too big for her years. Even now, centuries later, if you walk those same roads, you might still feel it, that quiet, sacred ache of something stirring in the dust. It didn't happen with thunder. There was no flash in the sky or trembling on the ground. The moment everything changed for Joan was so quiet, it could have been missed. She was kneeling in her usual spot, on the same worn stone near the altar, where the candles leaned slightly to the left from years of draught. Her hands were clasped, but she wasn't praying with words. She was just sitting with her thoughts, as she often did when the world outside felt too loud. The animals were fed. The water had been hauled. The bread was rising by the hearth. She had a little time before her mother called her back. And then something happened. A feeling first, not fear, not joy either. It was like the air around her suddenly thickened, like wool soaking in rain. Her ears didn't hear anything, not exactly, but her soul tilted. It was like someone had entered the chapel and walked straight into her without moving the door. A presence, not cold, not warm, just certain. Certain in a way that made her breathe differently. There was no face, no figure, only a sense that she was no longer alone. And then came the whisper, not in her ears, but inside her mind, a voice that was softer than wind but firmer than memory. She couldn't remember the exact words, not then, not clearly, but she remembered the feeling it left behind. She had been noticed, and not by the village, not by the baker's son who teased her or the tired soldiers who passed through. Someone far beyond them had turned toward her. Not because she was holy, not because she was ready, but because it was time. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She sat there, her hands still folded, heart suddenly beating with more purpose than fear. When she finally stood, the chapel looked the same, but it no longer felt like just a room. It felt like a doorway. She didn't tell anyone what happened. Not that day, not for a long time. Even as she walked home, carrying firewood and herbs, she kept looking over her shoulder as if something had followed her out. But there was only wind, only the familiar crunch of her feet on the path. Yet she couldn't explain why her chores felt lighter, or why the same sky she'd seen every day now felt deeper. As if the clouds above had secrets they were finally willing to share. She would go back to that chapel again and again, hoping the presence would return. And it did. Not always when she asked, but always when she needed. What Joan didn't know then was that the voice would soon speak, that it would ask something of her that most grown men would refuse. But for now she walked home quietly, with her sleeves rolled up and her lips pressed together. No one knew that the girl they passed on the road had just met her calling, and she didn't know yet how much it would cost her. Joan didn't see war before she smelled it. Long before she would ride with armor or carry a banner, she learned to recognize its scent. It came before the soldiers, before the smoke, before the shouting. It clung to the edges of the wind like something rotting too far away to name. It was a mix of old leather, rust, sweat, and something sour like vinegar that had turned. Whenever a band of fighters passed near Domrémy, that smell arrived first. It filled the trees. It drifted into her family's kitchen and soured the dough before it rose. She had learned not to ask questions when they came through. The men never stayed long. They never made eye contact. Some carried bandages stained the color of dried cherries. Others rode without shoes, their feet wrapped in cloth. They looked past the village as if something further down the road still haunted them. Joan used to hold her breath as they passed, but eventually she learned to breathe through it. You couldn't be afraid of something forever. At some point, you just learned how to stand still while it moved around you. One day, she was walking back from the chapel with a jug of water when she found a horse tied to the post outside the baker's house. It was taller than any she'd seen, with a scar that ran from its neck down to its shoulder. Its coat was the color of wet ash. No one was outside, no soldiers in sight, but the smell was there again. Thick and grim, she stepped carefully, her hand tightening around the handle of the jug. Inside the bakery, she found him. A man sitting on the floor with his back to the wall. His leg was bent unnaturally, and blood had soaked into the straw beneath him. His eyes were open but unfocused. He didn't look at her, even when she stepped into the doorway. He was whispering, not to her, Not to anyone, it seemed. His hands twitched as if trying to grab something that wasn't there. She stood still for a moment, unsure what to do. Then he turned toward her suddenly and spoke a single word. Not her name, just a word. One she didn't recognize. She dropped the jug and ran. The water spread across the dirt floor like a soft tide. It smelled clean and cold. For a moment it masked the other scent, the heavy, sour one. But only for a moment. She didn't tell anyone what she saw. When her mother asked about the jug, Joan just said she had tripped. That wasn't a lie. Not entirely. She had tripped on something that couldn't be seen. The edge of fear, maybe, or the beginning of knowing too much. That night, she didn't sleep well. The man's voice stayed in her ears. Not the word, the way it trembled, the way it sounded like someone remembering what it was like to be alive. The man in the bakery was gone. The next morning, the blood-soaked straw had been swept away, and the horse had vanished without sound. No one spoke of it. Not the baker, not the neighbors. As if war had stopped by, left its scent behind, and then rode off again. Joan didn't ask where he went. She already knew the answer. Some men leave the world without anyone bothering to name them. But something shifted after that. The voices in the chapel returned more often, still gentle, still quiet. But now they came with direction, and Joan began to listen in a new way, not just with her heart, but with her body. She noticed how her hands no longer shook when she heard thunder, how her feet no longer hesitated on muddy paths. She began to feel her courage, not as a feeling, but as a habit. Something she put on every morning like her boots. It was one of her brothers who found the sword, buried beneath a stack of firewood in an old abandoned shed behind their home. No one claimed it. It was rusted along the edges and the leather grip was torn. But it was real. He brought it inside, held it out like a gift, and laughed as Joan reached for it. Go ahead, try it, just don't drop it on your foot. She expected it to be lighter. She was wrong. The weight surprised her. It pulled down her arm, nearly made her lean. But once she adjusted her stance, she felt something she hadn't expected, familiarity, as if her body had been waiting to hold this shape. She didn't swing it. She didn't pose. She simply stood there in the glow of the firelight, sword in hand, heart beating with a strange kind of peace. That night, when everyone had gone to sleep, she snuck outside with it. The stars were dim, but the moon lit the yard just enough to see her breath in the cold air. She held the sword in front of her and tried to mimic what she had seen the soldiers do. She failed, mostly. Her footing was wrong, her grip too tight. The blade wobbled when she moved, but something inside her kept going. Step by step, swing by swing. Then something unexpected happened. She lost her grip. The sword slipped from her hand and landed in the dirt with a dull thud. She bent down to pick it up, and as she did, she noticed something just beside it. A small white flower growing alone in the frost, delicate and out of place, but alive. It hadn't been there yesterday. She stared at it for a long moment before picking up the blade again. This time she held it differently, not with pride, not with fear, but with care. The sword wasn't for power, it wasn't for show. It was for something she hadn't fully understood yet, and the flower had reminded her. Even warriors are meant to protect what is soft. It wasn't the sword that changed her. It was what followed. A different kind of tiredness settled into her bones. Not the ache of chores or long walks to the river, but the kind that clung even after rest. Joan noticed it first in her dreams. They stopped feeling like dreams and started feeling like warnings. She would wake before dawn with her fingers curled tight, her breath shallow, her eyes wide as if she'd just run from something she couldn't see. One night, she tried to sleep in the barn instead of the house. The animals were quiet, their warmth soft against the straw. She lay on her side, eyes fixed on a beam above her head, waiting for sleep to find her. It didn't. Instead, the silence grew louder, not with noise, but with awareness. She could feel every creak of the wood, every shift in the air. Something was different. She didn't know what, only that it asked her not to close her eyes. She sat up, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, and held her breath. Outside, an owl called once. Then the second call was sharper, not natural, a break in rhythm. She stepped outside, bare feet touching the cold ground. The moon was high but clouded. The air felt like it had been watching her before she opened the door. In the shadows by the well, she saw it. Not a figure, not a face, but a shape. Someone was standing there, unmoving. For a long moment, neither of Joan didn't call out. She didn't move. The figure shifted its weight just slightly, then turned and disappeared into the trees behind the house. She didn't scream, she didn't chase. She went back inside, locked the barn door from the inside, and sat beside the goat pen until sunrise. No one believed her when she mentioned it. Her father shrugged and said she had imagined it. Her mother gave her a worried look but said nothing. Her brother teased her. But Joan didn't press the issue. She knew what she saw. More importantly, she knew what she felt. That something was beginning to follow her, and it didn't wear a soldier's uniform or carry a weapon. It came with silence. It came at night, and it waited. After that, she learned to sleep lightly. Her dreams became short, her rest cautious. She no longer curled into blankets fully, always leaving one foot ready to rise. She placed the old sword by the door, even if it did little more than comfort her. Sleep, once a gift, became something she had to protect. She no longer trusted night to hold her gently. Something had entered her life that didn't want her rested. Not yet. Not while she was still listening, not while she was still deciding. And each morning, as she washed her face and tied her apron, she wondered if it would come back. The thing that stood by the well and waited without speaking. The figure by the well never returned, at least not in a way Joan could see, but its absence didn't feel like peace. It felt like a silence preparing for something. Days passed, then weeks. The chapel visits became longer, the voices clearer. Joan was no longer wondering if she'd be called. She was simply waiting to be told when. Her hands were steadier now, her fear quieter. The sword stayed near her bed, no longer just. Something had shifted inside her, and soon it would have to show on the outside too. She was told to learn to ride. The old farm horse wasn't built for speed or glory. He was stubborn, broad, and preferred eating to listening. But he was the only one her family could spare. Her brother led him out one grey morning, reins looped around his arm, laughing before she even tried. "You're going to fall," he said, handing her the rope. "Just don't break anything you can't walk on." The first attempt was clumsy. The saddle was old and tilted slightly to the left. Joan's foot missed the stirrup twice, and when she finally pulled herself up, the horse turned in a slow, bored circle. He had no interest in being impressive, and neither did she. She just needed to stay on. By the third day, the soreness in her legs made her limp. The armor she borrowed from a neighbor's cousin didn't fit well. The breastplate hung too low. The shoulder pieces rubbed her neck raw. But she wore it anyway. Not because it looked heroic, but because she needed to feel how heavy this path would really be. She practiced in the field behind her house, far enough from the road that no one could see her stumble. She didn't ride fast. She didn't shout commands. She just stayed on, day after day, bruises blooming under her sleeves, dust catching in her teeth. And slowly her body stopped resisting. The weight of the armor stopped pulling her down. Her back straightened, her balance sharpened. Even the horse begrudgingly began to move with her instead of against her. One afternoon, she was riding alone when the wind changed suddenly. It brought with it a new sound, not the hooves or her breath, but a voice. This time not inside the chapel, not inside her head. It came from somewhere above and behind her. She pulled the horse to a stop, heart steady, listening. The words were few, just a direction. A place she didn't know but felt she would soon find. She dismounted slowly, her feet heavy from practice, and stood still in the middle of the field. The horse wandered off toward the grass. Joan turned toward the horizon where the voice had pointed, and in that quiet space between her breath and the wind, she realized something strange. She had been preparing for a journey, but maybe the journey had already begun, and no one had told her. She didn't sleep the night before, not because of fear, but because everything had gone still. The air inside the tent was colder than outside. Joan lay on her side, armor at her feet, hands pressed flat beneath her cheek. Around her, the sounds of camp were muffled. A few voices murmured near the fires. Horses shuffled in the distance. But mostly there was waiting. And the waiting was louder than anything. When dawn came, it did not rise with beauty. The sky was the color of old wool, and the ground still held the frost of night. Joan sat up slowly, rubbing her palms together until they stung. Her fingers were stiff from holding the reins too long the day before. Her thighs ached. Her shoulders felt as if they carried something beyond bone and muscle. But she did not complain. She did not speak. Samaun had left a cloth, wrapped biscuit beside her saddle. It was still warm. She didn't eat it. She just held it in her hand, watching the horizon where the mist hadn't yet cleared. This was the morning she had seen in her dreams. Not the battle itself, just this moment, the silence, the stillness, the weight of breath. A soldier passed by and nodded at her. He said nothing, but his eyes searched her face, perhaps looking for fear, perhaps looking for confirmation that the rumors were true, that the girl who heard voices would fight alongside them today. She returned his gaze without blinking. He looked away first. She dressed slowly, not with ceremony but care. Each piece of armor now felt familiar, like parts of a story she had stepped into. The sword was cleaned, the leather straps tightened. When she stood fully dressed, she felt neither large nor small, just ready. And that was enough. The captain called for her sooner than she expected. She stepped outside the tent and saw them gathered, not in neat lines, but in pockets of men, sharpening blades, murmuring prayers, avoiding each other's eyes. They made space for her when she approached, not out of fear, out of something else. Curiosity, maybe, or belief wrapped in doubt. She was handed a banner, not her sword, not today. The fabric was white and gold, catching the wind in lazy waves. She gripped the pole and felt it pull against her, as if it had its own pulse. She didn't ask why she was given it. She already knew. Today she would not strike. Today she would be seen. And as they began to move, slow at first, toward a place none of them could picture without blood, Joan lifted the banner high. It shook slightly in the breeze, then steadied. She did not speak. She did not cry out. But every step forward whispered the truth, that this was not the beginning of courage. It was the proof she already had it. She did not expect the banner to feel so alive. It wasn't just cloth and colour. It moved with a kind of restless will, tugging her forward, catching wind even when the air seemed still. Joan's fingers tightened around the wooden shaft as she walked, the weight of it strange but certain. The men walked behind her, slow and careful, their armor clinking in rhythm. No one spoke to her, but none of them looked away either. The first hour passed without sound beyond the shuffle of feet and distant crows. Then came the climb. A hill she hadn't known would be there. Her legs burned as she stepped upward, the banner pulling against her like it wanted to fly ahead and leave her behind. When she reached the top, her breath caught, not from the effort, but from the sight. Below was the field, their destination, their line and beyond it, a world ready to break. But something else happened first. As the men lined up behind her, one of the older soldiers, his beard streaked with ash, his jaw clenched against memory, sank suddenly to his knees. At first she thought he'd stumbled, but he knelt with purpose, eyes fixed on her. Then another did the same. Then another. It happened without order, without signal, a quiet ripple of surrender. Not to her, not exactly, but to what they thought she might be. She lowered the banner slightly, unsure what to do. The voices had said she would lead. They hadn't told her how. Her hand ached from gripping the pole, her wrist trembling slightly. She swallowed, steadied herself, and lifted it high again. That's when it happened. The wind stopped, not slowed, stopped. The banner froze in the air mid-motion, as if held in place by unseen hands. And in that stillness, Joan heard it. Not a voice this time, a cry, distant, but sharp. Not from the other side, from a child. She turned toward the sound instinctively. None of the men reacted. It was as if only she had heard it. Her eyes scanned the edge of the field, and there, just beyond the tree line, a small figure moved. A child, barefoot, too thin, clutching something wrapped in cloth, running toward them. Not away. Joan stepped forward before thinking. One pace, too. The banner dragged behind her. The child ran harder now, arms flailing, lips moving, but too far to understand. And just as Joan opened her mouth to speak, the child vanished. Not behind a tree, not into the ground, just gone, as if she'd blinked and the world had removed her. A hand touched her arm, the old soldier standing again, eyes narrowed. "Are you well?" he asked. Joan nodded, but her heart said otherwise, because for the first time since she'd heard the voices, she wasn't sure who was calling her, or what it might cost next. The child never came back. Joan searched the tree line with her eyes as the battle pressed near, but the space where the figure had appeared remained empty. It left behind no trail, no sound, not even a broken twig beneath the brush. But it had changed something in her, not with fear, with alertness, the kind that sharpens the edges of silence. That morning, Joan had walked forward as a girl holding a banner. By nightfall, something else had taken shape inside her. They began to listen differently. It started with small things, a suggestion to take a different path around the marsh, a quiet warning that arrows might be waiting behind the ridge. She didn't command. She only spoke. And the men, once skeptical, once reluctant to follow a teenager wrapped in cloth and steel, began to respond without argument. One man, tall and broad, who had never spoken to her before, asked if she would bless his blade. He held it out awkwardly, like a question he wasn't sure how to form. Joan placed her hand on the flat of the sword, not because she knew what blessing meant, but because he needed something to believe in, and she had already learned that presence is often more powerful than answers. Later that night, as they gathered near the fire, the captain himself called her over. He did not bow or kneel or soften his voice, but he did ask her opinion on what came next. Not just where to march, but why. Joan did not give a speech. She did not quote scripture. She simply told him what the voice had shown her. A picture of a narrow path through woods, a rise in the ground where the sun would fall just right at midday. She described it as if she had already walked it, though she had not. At least, not with her body. He listened without interrupting, When she finished, he nodded once and said, "Then we'll go where you say." The fire cracked between them. A younger soldier leaned close after she returned to her place by the embers. "You're not afraid, are you?" he asked. Joan turned toward him, brushing soot from her sleeve. "Not of the fight?" she said. He tilted his head. "Then what?" She looked up at the stars. They were dim tonight, as if veiled. "Of being wrong," she whispered. He didn't speak again. She felt their eyes on her more often after that. Not with doubt, but with expectation. She had become something they needed. Not because she had proven herself, but because she hadn't run, because she kept showing up, with bruises and dirt and questions of her own. And still she stood. The voices were quieter that night, not absent, just watching, waiting to see if she would still believe them when others began to believe her. And somewhere behind her ribs she felt the first flicker of what belief can become. The next morning the sky opened with rain. Not the gentle kind that softened fields and made children laugh. This was the kind that turned dirt into paste and soaked everything through before a word could be spoken. The fire from the night before had gone out with a hiss. Joan sat up in her tent, boots already damp from the pooling water beneath her mat. There was no voice today, just weather. She stepped out, armor half laced, eyes blinking against the drizzle. The camp was quieter than usual. No one wanted to speak while soaked to the skin. They moved like shadows, hunched and slow, the smell of wet wool rising from their cloaks. Joan's hands were red from the cold. Her fingers stung as she tightened her straps. A soldier passed her and offered a nod without a word. His teeth chattered when he smiled. Simone handed her bread. It was wrapped in cloth, but the cloth had failed. It was cold and wet. She bit into it anyway, chewing slowly as she walked the camp's edge. This was the part no story ever told, the part where glory smelled like mold and tasted like dirt. Her blisters had returned. The inside of her heel was raw, the skin split where the leather rubbed. She said nothing about it, just walked slower. Each step was a quiet agreement between her body and her will. She found a boy crouched behind the supply tent, holding his knee. His cheek was scratched, his tunic torn. He looked up at her like she might scold him, but she only knelt and handed him the rest of her bread. He hesitated before taking it. "You don't have to," he whispered. "I know," she said. She watched him eat in silence, the rain softening around them. It wasn't the first time she had shared what little she had, but something about the way his fingers trembled made it different. She stood again, blinking at the horizon, and for a brief second she thought she saw the child from the field again, just at the edge of the woods, not moving, not blinking. But when she looked again, there was only fog. That night her feet burned with ache. She removed her boots in the tent and saw the damage clearly. Red lines, swelling, a small blood stain at the heel. She tore a piece of her linen underskirt and wrapped it tight. Then she laid back and stared at the ceiling of canvas above her. The voice came just as her eyes closed. Not loud, not clear, just one word forward. She whispered it back. The glory they spoke of never mentioned how hard it was to walk when the ground refused to hold you. It never mentioned wet bread or bleeding feet or sleep that never really came. But Joan was learning. The ache was not a punishment. It was proof. Proof that her feet still moved, even when everything else wanted her to stop. The rain stopped just before dusk. It didn't leave gently. It ended all at once, like a door slamming shut. The sky didn't clear, but the wind slowed, and smoke from rekindled fires began curling upward again. Joan sat near one of them, her feet tucked close, boots drying nearby. The ache hadn't faded, but the warmth helped. Around her, the men settled into the rhythm of evening. quiet, hungry, heavy from the weight of another day survived. Joan of the older soldiers began to speak. Not loudly, just a soft story told between bites of bread and mouthfuls of wine. He talked about a girl he'd loved once, a seamstress with long arms and quiet eyes. She had vanished during a siege. No one found her. But he still carried the ribbon she had tied around his wrist the day he left. He untied it now and held it up to the fire. It was pale blue and frayed at the edges. Another man offered a tale about his brother, how they had traded places before battle to spare each other's pride. His voice cracked halfway through, but he kept talking. The words felt heavier than his armor. Joan listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer her own stories. Not yet. She didn't know how to tell the truth without it sounding like prophecy. And she wasn't ready to carry their grief with hers. The younger ones stayed mostly quiet, leaning in, letting the words of the older men fill the spaces between bites. Someone passed her a skin of wine. She shook her head. He offered it again. This time she accepted. It burned as it went down. She coughed once and handed it back. The fire cracked like it had hurt her. Then a man she hadn't seen before spoke. His face was lined with more than age. His hands were too still. "Do the voices ever lie to you?" he asked. The camp fell silent. Heads turned. Even the wind seemed to stop listening. His eyes were the color of ash, washed out and watching. "No," she said. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He just turned back toward the flames and stared. But something in her stomach twisted. Not because she doubted her answer, but because she had never thought to ask that question before. Later, when the fire had died and the others drifted to sleep, Joan stayed behind. The ribbon lay abandoned in the dirt. She picked it up and wrapped it once around her wrist before lying down. The stars were faint that night, like they were too tired to shine. The ground was hard beneath her, and her dreams were short. But before sleep came, she whispered a thought she'd never said aloud. "If they do lie to me, I wouldn't know the difference." And the fire, now just embers, gave no answer at all. She woke before the others. The fire was long dead, and the air had the stillness that only comes just before morning. Joan sat up slowly, careful not to wake the men sleeping near her. The ribbon still circled her wrist. She had dreamt of walking barefoot through snow, but when she looked down, her feet were warm, tucked under the edge of her cloak. A dream then, but the feeling had stayed with her. Cold, not in the body, but behind the ribs. She stepped out of the camp and walked toward the woods. The trees were quiet, holding on to the last of the night. She passed the line where the horses were tied, her fingers brushing one of their flanks as she moved by. It shuddered slightly, but did not stir. At the edge of the clearing, she knelt. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because someone was watching, but because the weight of something unsaid had grown too full inside her. She didn't begin with words. She began with silence. She had learned that silence, if held long enough, speaks back. Her eyes were closed, but her breath stayed even. She wasn't asking for victory. She wasn't asking for signs. She was asking for something simpler, that if she was being led, she wouldn't walk blind. That if she was being used, it would be for good. That the voices, whatever they truly were, still knew the shape of her name. She thought of the soldier's question again. "Do the voices ever lie?" she had answered with confidence. But sitting here alone beneath trees that didn't care who she was, that confidence felt thinner. She had seen things others hadn't, heard things they never would. But she was still just a girl with sore feet and an aching back, and too many eyes watching her now like she was more than she ever asked to be. Her lips finally parted. She whispered her name. Not a prayer, just a reminder. "I am Joan." The leaves above her rustled lightly, though there was no wind. A single bird called out. Then silence again, but this time she felt something different. Not a voice, not a vision, just a warmth that spread slowly through her chest and down her arms. Her fingers tingled, her shoulders eased. She opened her eyes and saw nothing strange, but she didn't need to. The ache inside had quieted. That was enough. She stood, brushing the dirt from her knees, and looked out over the field. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the horizon had begun to soften. Soon the camp would stir, the swords would shine, the eyes would return to her. But right now, for this brief breath between darkness and dawn, she was not a symbol or a saint. She was just a girl who had knelt in the woods and been heard. The morning broke slow and gold. By the time Joan returned to camp, the men were already moving. Some were eating in silence, others sharpening their blades. The mood had shifted. It wasn't fear. It was something harder to name, a kind of watching. Joan felt it as soon as she stepped into view. Not the usual glances of awe or doubt. This was something different. A kind of distance that hadn't been there yesterday. She approached the captain's tent to report the route she had seen in her prayer. He nodded, distracted. He didn't ask questions like he usually did. He didn't meet her eyes. She waited, expecting the usual follow-up, a request for more detail. It didn't come. He dismissed her with a low voice and turned away. Joan stepped back, confused but quiet. There was no confrontation, no whisper of suspicion, just a gentle closing of space around her, a small gap in every conversation she tried to enter. The same soldiers who had once pressed her for blessings now nodded stiffly and looked past her. She walked the outer edge of the camp and tried not to notice. But she noticed. It was the stable boy who told her the truth. He was no more than 10, always running messages or cleaning hooves, too small to matter and too fast to be caught listening. He found her near the supply wagons, where she was helping a young archer bind a twisted ankle. When the boy passed behind her, he dropped a folded strip of parchment at her side and kept walking. No glance, no pause, just movement. She waited until she was alone to open it. The message was short. They think you know too much. They say you speak too quietly to be trusted. She read it twice, then folded it into her sleeve and stood up. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even cruel. That's what stung the most. It was just suspicion, simple, unspoken. Born not from something she did, but from the silence she carried. From the way her answers had no origin they could understand. From the fact that she had walked into their world from a place no one else could see. That evening, when she stood to pray before the fire, no one joined her. They let her finish. But when she sat back down, the space around her stayed open, like she'd become a shadow of herself, still visible, but no longer fully among them. She didn't cry, she didn't plead, she just turned her palms to the heat of the fire and whispered, "Let it be enough that you believe me." No answer came. Only the quiet crackle of flame, and the sudden understanding that some battles begin long before the enemy draws near. Some begin in silence, among the faces you once called safe. The sky stayed grey for 3 days, not storming, not clear, just still. The kind of stillness that settles deep in the bones and makes time feel strange. The army didn't move. Orders were delayed. Scouts returned with conflict. Some said the enemy had vanished. Others said they were circling. No one was certain of anything, so the camp waited. Joan waited with them. The days stretched. There were no battles, no parades, no voices in her head. Just chores, carrying water, rebinding wounds, rechecking supplies. The kind of work that reminded her of home, of Doma Femi, of days spent washing clothes and listening for distant hooves. She peeled potatoes until her hands stung. She mended someone's torn sleeve with thread she had saved. She didn't ask for thanks. She didn't speak unless spoken to. The men still kept their distance, not cruelly, just with caution, as if whatever light had drawn them before now burned too bright to touch. Joan felt it too in quieter ways. Her solitude no longer bothered her. It comforted her. She no longer needed their belief to remember what she had seen and what she had been shown. On the second night, she walked out past the tents toward the edge of a field where the grass grew in uneven patches. She sat cross-legged in the dirt, pressing her fingers into the earth. It was soft, damp. The smell of soil reminded her of planting season, when her father would grunt instructions and her brothers would pretend to listen. She smiled at the memory. Then her smile faded. A small wooden charm lay in the grass beside her, worn smooth by time, a carving of a lamb. She picked it up and held it in her palm. It didn't belong to her. It wasn't there yesterday. She looked around but saw no one. Just the rustling of leaves and the distant creak of saddles in the wind. She didn't return it. She tied it to the ribbon, still looped around her wrist. The next morning, a letter arrived. Hand delivered, no seal, no name. You are being watched by more than one camp. Joan folded it without reacting. Her face stayed still, her heart steady. She tucked it into her boot and said nothing. She spent that day tending to the horses. Quiet work. Repetitive. Their warmth helped her forget the cold in the eyes around her. One of them, a grey mare with a scarred flank, pressed its head against her shoulder as she brushed its coat. It didn't move away for a long time. She let it stay. That night, she didn't kneel to pray. She simply sat beside the fire, the lamb charm in one hand and her thoughts in the other. No words, no visions. Just a quiet understanding that even on the days without swords or shouts, something was shifting. And not all battles are won when men are watching. The waiting ended on a morning that offered no warning. The sky was low, thick with clouds that never broke open, just hung there like a curtain about to fall. Joan had risen early, her fingers still wrapped around the lamb charm she now wore tucked beneath her tunic. There was talk of movement again, scouts returning, a command to relocate. The energy felt different, not urgent but unsettled. She saddled the horse herself, tightening the straps as the others loaded their gear. No one looked at her. That was no longer strange. She had learned how to walk among silence as if it belonged to her. The road was narrow and wet. Branches scratched at shoulders as they passed through a wood that didn't feel welcoming. Joan rode near the front, the banner furled at her side. The voices had not spoken in days, but her sense of direction never left her. She followed it without questioning why it pointed the way it did. When the attack came, it didn't sound like thunder. It sounded like confusion, hooves pounding in the wrong direction, screams cut off too quickly. A sharp clatter of steel against steel, but closer than it should have been. Then her horse stumbled. She hit the ground hard, her breath gone in a flash, her cheek pressed into mud that smelled of iron. By the time she stood, hands grabbing for anything solid, the banner had fallen. She didn't reach for it. A figure approached fast from the trees. Not an enemy she recognized. No colors, no crest. Just a man with eyes too calm and rope already in hand. She moved backward, but another blocked her path. Then another. She was pulled from the edge like a thread someone had been waiting to cut. Her arms were bound behind her before she could speak. She didn't cry out. She looked at each face, but none of them looked back. They didn't drag her. They walked her, like someone who had agreed to go, as if the moment had always belonged to them. She was taken from the field as the sun began to show, not in glory, but in a pale smear behind clouds. The men who had once fought beside her didn't follow. Some watched. One turned away. No one called her name, that hurt more than the ropes, the silence. She didn't ask where they were taking her. She already knew. Not the place, the purpose. As they led her toward the road, her foot caught on something. She stumbled, looked down. It was the lamb charm fallen somehow from her tunic. One of the soldiers reached for it, but she stepped forward and crushed it beneath her boot before he could. A soft crack, a quick silence. She kept walking, and for the first time since the voices first came to her, she felt completely, utterly alone. They did not keep her in a dungeon, not at first. The room was small, built of stone, lit by a single window too high to reach. The cot was wooden and creaked whenever she shifted. Her wrists bore the red lines of rope that had since been replaced by iron. She didn't ask questions. They gave no names, no explanations. A bowl of water appeared in the morning. Bread followed in the evening. No words, just footsteps and a door that never opened fully. Joan sat quietly most days, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. The silence here was heavier than the kind she knew before. It didn't offer comfort or space. It pressed in, like it wanted her to speak just so it could swallow the sound. One afternoon, the light through the window shifted enough for her to see the dust in the air. It floated in slow spirals, soft and aimless. She watched it for a long time. Then she closed her eyes and whispered a name. Not hers. Not theirs, just his. The one she had followed through woods and smoke and silence. The one who had spoken without lips and led her without maps. There was no answer, but she kept whispering anyway, not pleading, not bargaining, just remembering how it felt to be heard. On the third night she awoke to a noise. Not footsteps, not keys, a voice, but not one she had heard before. It came from the other side of the wall, soft, low, speaking in Latin, the words broken by coughs. A prayer, familiar and unfamiliar at once. She moved closer to the stone, pressed her cheek against its cold surface and listened. He was praying for strength, not deliverance, not revenge, just strength. When he paused, she answered in the same language. One word, Amen. There was silence, then a breath of laughter, not mocking, grateful. He never asked her name, and she didn't ask his. They exchanged fragments, verses, memories of psalms. No full conversations, just offerings. The kind only prisoners know how to give. Days passed. The bread, the water warm. The voices outside her door shifted. More urgent, less curious. They no longer watched her as if she were dangerous. They watched her as if she had something they couldn't name. That unsettled them more. One morning, they didn't bring water. Just a man with a paper. He stood in the doorway and read without emotion. Words about charges and trials and judgment. She listened. Eyes steady, hands folded. When he finished, he looked at her as if expecting fear. She nodded once, then asked him if he had eaten. That night, when the window filled with moonlight and her wrists ached from cold iron, Joan whispered her prayers again, louder this time. Not because she needed answers, but because the chains did not. They already knew who she was. And still, she prayed. Because hope, unlike walls, does not rust. The courtroom was cold, vast, and filled with shadows. Joan stood before men whose faces were stern masks, their eyes sharp with questions she had no intention of answering. The air smelled of damp stone and old parchment, heavy with secrets that had never been spoken aloud. She wore a rough woolen dress, her chains clinking softly as she moved. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady but soft, not weak, just careful. They asked her about voices, about visions, about angels and saints. They twisted her words, turning them into traps. Joan did not stumble. She answered honestly, but never more than she had to. The questions were not meant to seek truth, only to find fault, to bind her with words as tightly as her wrists were bound with iron. She watched the faces in the room, some curious, others cold, many tired. Men who wore power like a shield, but feared the power in a girl who dared to stand before them. They called her a heretic, a witch, a liar. She let the words fall like stones, heavy but unable to break her resolve. Her silence spoke louder than any defense. One judge leaned forward and asked if she would recant, if she would deny everything she had seen, heard, believed. Joan looked at him then, not with fear, not with anger, but with a calm that unsettled the room. "If I am wrong, may God forgive me," she said. "But if I am right, who will forgive them?" There was no answer. Her words lingered in the stillness longer than any voice in the room. A challenge, a question they could not escape. She was not there to win. She was there to stand, to hold the line between what she knew and what they feared. The trial was not about justice. It was about control, about breaking the shape of a story they could not understand. Outside, the sky remained grey. The sun, Joan felt the weight of it pressing down, but inside, a light kept flickering. Not from candles, not from hope, from something deeper, a truth no chain could hold. When the verdict came, it was no surprise. Guilty, condemned. The sentence carried the weight of centuries and whispers. Joan accepted it without plea. She did not cry, she did not beg, she simply prepared. Her captors moved with less ceremony than she imagined. No guards raised voices, no crowds gathered, just cold footsteps and distant echoes. As she was led away, she glanced once at the judges. Their faces had hardened, but behind the stone was something else. A shadow of doubt, or perhaps fear. The kind that lingers long after words have been spoken. In the quiet before the end, Joan whispered a prayer, not for herself, not for mercy, but for those who would remember, for those who would hear her story when the silence was broken. Because sometimes the greatest battles are not fought with sword or shield, but with courage to speak truth when no one else will listen. The morning she was taken to the place of fire, the sky was heavy and low. The air smelled sharp, like the edge of winter wrapped tight around the world. Joan walked not with chains, but with a quiet resolve. The crowd gathered in silence, as if the flames had already spoken before they were lit. She felt the weight of their eyes, heavy with questions, judgments, and something she could not name. Not hatred, not pity, something closer to disbelief. She stood tall, the rough rope replaced by the silence of knowing. Her voice came steady when she spoke, not to plead or curse, but to speak the names she carried in her heart. The names of those who believed, those who doubted, those who never had a voice at all. Her words floated on the wind like a fragile banner. They did not stop the flames, but they did not die with her. As the fire was lit, the heat rushed like a tide, fierce and unrelenting. Joan's breath caught once, then steadied. The smoke curled upward, swallowing the girl and leaving behind only a story that would not burn, a story carried on whispered prayers, in the silence of those who dared to remember. The people who watched that day saw only the ashes. They did not see the courage woven through each breath she took, the hope that lived beyond the smoke, the quiet strength that no fire could consume. Years later, the voices she heard would still be spoken of, not as legends, but as echoes, not as miracles, but as truths hidden beneath the weight of fear. Joan of Arc would become more than a name. She would become a question. A reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are not fought to be won, but to be remembered. And on the dirt roads of Domrémy, in the silence of the chapel, in the hearts of those who listen closely, the story still breathes, soft and steady, like the footsteps of a girl who carried a nation in her hands and walked into the wind without looking back. Because sometimes the bravest thing is not the fight itself, it is the fire that follows. Tonight we walked alongside Joan, not as a legend or a distant hero, but as a young girl stepping quietly into a calling far greater than herself. We felt the weight of the sword, the chill of sleepless nights, the ache of waiting days without battle. We saw her courage bloom, not in grand victories, but in whispered prayers, in moments of silence and in the strength to stand when others turned away. Joan's story reminds us that bravery is often quiet, that true strength comes from holding on to faith when everything seems lost, and that sometimes the fiercest battles happen within. Her legacy lives not just in history books, but in every soul who has ever felt alone and still chosen to rise. In the soft light of dawn, in the dust of forgotten roads, her footsteps echo, a call to keep walking, keep believing, and keep fighting for what is right, even when the world says you can't. Thank you for joining this journey through the quiet moments that shaped a warrior. If you found peace in this story, consider subscribing and sharing. Let's keep uncovering the gentle truths behind the legends and find rest in history's softest whispers. Until next time, may your dreams be calm and your spirit strong.